Hello, and welcome to the Movie Universe. I'm your host, Movie Fan. Not too long ago, I did a top 5 video talking about the worst final episodes ever made. But there are actually a few great final episodes. So today, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 best final episodes ever made. Starting as always with number 5, Leave It to Beaver. This final episode, entitled The Family Scrapbook, doesn't really get too much recognition. In fact, as far as I know, it doesn't really get any recognition at all. However, I think it needs to be recognized. How it goes is June finds the old family scrapbook, and throughout the entire episode, they're looking through the scrapbook, and you're seeing pictures of all the things they did throughout the entire 6 seasons that the show was on. And with each of the pictures, you get a little flashback. And it makes perfect sense because, in a way, you get the impression that they really are looking back at all they accomplished throughout the 6 years that they've been together on this show. This episode also has the added bonus of learning where Beaver got his nickname from. Because if you've seen the show, you would know that his name is really Theodore. And how it goes is, when Theodore was born, his older brother Wally was just a little tyke, and he couldn't say Theodore properly, so he pronounced his name as Tweeter instead of Theodore. In a nutshell, their parents, Ward and June, taught Wally to say the name Beaver instead of Tweeter, and that's how he got the nickname Beaver. But like I said, that's only a bonus. The real main focus point here is all the things they did together. It's a great finisher. In fact, this was the first show to actually do that. There have been some other shows that have done it, like Emergency, City Guys, and an overrated piece of garbage that will not be named. And I'll tell you a little secret. I hate flashback episodes. I say that because usually they're used as filler time. And that's all flashback episodes usually are, just filler time. Matlock was guilty of this for years. There was at least one episode per season where it was nothing but a series of flashbacks, and it got old really quick. And that's why I hate flashback episodes. But in this case, this was them looking back at all the great times they had together on the screen. Now, granted, they didn't show all the greatest moments, like the legendary episode where Beaver falls into the bowl of soup. There was no way they could make that work if they tried. But still, it was great. Number 4. Perry Mason. The episode was entitled The Case of the Final Fade Out, and rightfully so, because this story takes place in Hollywood, where a young actor is killed. The producer is accused of killing him, and then the producer ends up killed himself. Perry solves both murders because they were both killed by the same man. And it pretty much ends with Perry, Della, and Paul planning to work on another case. Now, what makes this episode so great is obviously the case itself. It was a real head-scratcher because we were all trying to figure out who did it. But what really makes this episode so memorable is the cast that was in it. Not just our main cast of characters, but it also has 3 guest stars in there. The first guest star is Jackie Coogan, who we all know as Uncle Fester. The second one is the legendary Dick Clark. And the third one is Earl Stanley Gardner himself. That's right, the Earl Stanley Gardner, the man who wrote the Perry Mason novels, which of course led to the creation of this legendary TV series. And if you think that's interesting, you'll love this. Earl Stanley Gardner plays the judge in this episode. And as far as I know, there's never been a final episode that included the person that actually created the characters. Number 3. Inuyasha, The Final Act. Now, in my worst final episode video, I told you about the first final episode that they created, entitled The Bond Between Them, Use the Sacred Jewel Shard. And you might remember that I said that the fans were so offended that they demanded a proper ending. This was that proper ending. Now, I could try and talk about the final episode, but let's get real. The whole season is the final episode. But of course, if I try to tell you the whole season, we'll be here all year. So, to put it simply, it wraps everything up, from Koga and the Sacred Jewel Shards in his legs, to Kagome and Inuyasha getting together, and of course, the destruction of Naraku and the Sacred Jewel Shard. It's a great final season, definitely a must-see, and I would highly recommend that if you're an Inuyasha fan or an anime fan altogether, look this up. Believe me, it's worth it. There are some episodes that are a little subpar because they rushed right through it just to try to tie in the story, but it's forgivable because the main core is there, and it's wrapped up beautifully. But of course, I cannot talk about this without bringing up one big fact. As I said before, the original final episode offended so many of the fans that they demanded that they get a proper ending. And 5 years later, the fans got what they wanted. This has never happened before in the history of television, and I highly doubt it will ever happen again, because let's not forget the notorious ending for The Sopranos, where they just cut to black and that was it. And people were demanding a real ending, a rewrite, the works, and they never did it. They just said, too bad, we're not going to do it. Whereas for here, they did it. Number 2, Arthur, all grown up. Now this one's a recent final episode, and I'm sure everybody knows how it went. But I'll tell you anyway. It starts off with Arthur accidentally getting the wrong book from the library. So he and his friends go to get the right one. They try to find the librarian, and they find a room that has this hidden toy that predicts their futures. Of course, the kids are automatically saying, that's not going to be me, that's not going to be me, I can't picture that being me. While Arthur, unfortunately, does not get to see his future, because the toy just went out on him. So they all decide to leave. And as they go, an old gentleman who I presume is another fellow librarian gives back the book to Arthur and says, why don't you give it a shot? They got some pretty good pictures in here to draw. And all of a sudden it's 20 years later, and we see that Muffy is running for mayor. George is actually running a local business. Francine has actually become a businesswoman. Buster, believe it or not, actually becomes a teacher. And here's a shocker for you. DW becomes a police officer. Didn't see that one coming. And Arthur becomes, well, basically a writer. He actually wrote a story about, well, himself. It's a great moment because you see that they all pretty much became successful people in their own way. Even though we don't really know how Arthur's book turns out, I think we got a fair idea considering how this show went on for 25 years. It was a perfect finisher to a show running this long. And that's pretty rare because most shows usually don't go as long as 25 years and come out with a great finisher at the same time. It also has some hidden surprises in there. Like, for instance, the original voice actor to Arthur comes back to reprise his role. And we also get a little shout out from the artists. The room number that they find, where the hidden game is labeled A113, which is basically a little tip of the cap by artists made for their classroom, because that's a classroom where they learn to animate. And it's been a tradition ever since. But of course, the biggest surprise was the old gentleman at the library. That was actually Mark Brown himself. That's right, the man who wrote the books. He got to be in this final episode. And it's just awesome because here he is telling Arthur, why don't you give this book a chance? And here Arthur is writing a story on himself. Isn't that great or what? This is a finisher that proves that even now, final episodes can still be good in this day and age. But of course, that pales in comparison to number 1, The Red Green Show. Now, if you've seen this, you know that it's strictly a comedy, and it was one of the greatest comedies around back during the late 90s and early 2000s. It was truly a great show. It had tons of great laughs, and it actually went on for 15 seasons. It was that popular. And even after the show went off the air, it was in syndication for even longer, and continues to this day on YouTube. But what really makes this final episode so memorable was how they did it. The central core of this episode was the fact that Red's nephew Harold was getting married, and he does get married at the very end of the episode, which is truly a great moment. But even more so, Red and Harold drop some little hints that this is the final episode. They talk about how they've gone on for 15 years and that they're amazed they've even made it for that long because, sure, other shows have gone on for 15 years, but those other shows were actually good. Oh, man. Oh, that's comedy for you. And throughout the episode, everything that goes on has to do with the fact that this is the season finale. For instance, the final word in the Possum Lodge word game was finale. On the Adventures with Bill segment, Bill turns in all his props and Red and him flash back to all the crazy adventures they had. And for Red's little advice segment, better known to us as I'm pulling for you, we're all in this together. To put it simply, he talks about saying goodbye in his own special way. He pretty much says it like this. When people are friends, they never really say goodbye. They stay in each other's minds, and every time they think about them, they're together again. The rest of that little monologue is basically him saying that it's time for him to move on. And he ends his little monologue by saying,
"It's been a great ride, and every time we hear the sweet sound of a strip being torn off a roll of duct tape, we'll think of each other.
And after Harold gets married, he thanks the audience for watching the show for the past 15 years, and Harold ends it with his final word of keep your stick on the ice. And they give us little pictures of how the lodge members are doing right now. They've moved on with their lives, that sort of gag. Just one final joke for the audience, and it was great. And that's why The Red Green Show is number 1 on this list. However, we're not done yet because there is a final episode that is so legendary that it supersedes number 1, and that is number 0, the legendary MASH episode, Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen. Now, I'm sure everybody knows this episode very well because it has been re-aired several times on MeTV, and it is so legendary that people are still talking about it. It was the perfect way to wrap up a series, especially a series that ran as long as this one did. The main theme of this final episode was the fact that the Korean War is finally coming to an end, and everybody's basically getting ready to go. They're making plans as to what they're going to do when they get back to the U.S., and some other big moments happen, like, for instance, Corporal Klinger, he gets married and decides to stay in Korea to help find his blushing bride's parents. And Father Mulcahy goes deaf because of mortar fire and decides to devote his time to helping the deaf. Meanwhile, Major Winchester loses his love for music because some prisoners of war get killed, and they were just musicians, they weren't soldiers. And of course, Major Hot Lips Houlihan decides she's going to make her own way. And in the end, they all leave one at a time. Of course, the most memorable moment is when Hawkeye gets in that helicopter, and as the helicopter goes up, we see that all the rocks on the helipad were formed into one word, goodbye. Now, they put it down that that was B.J. Honeycutt saying goodbye to Hawkeye, but in actuality, that was the producers, the directors, the cast, everyone saying goodbye to the audience. A great finisher to a great series. If you haven't seen it, look it up, and you'll see why this is the greatest final episode ever made. And I'll tell you this, there will never be a final episode that will ever come close to the legendary fame that this one has. This is Movie Fan, signing off.